Hi, Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, and today's contract tip has to do with tenant procurement, or in other words, placing a tenant in a property that is for rent on a lease. Now, this is not about property management. Maximum One does not allow our agents to practice property management for the public, and there are very few brokerages that let their agents practice residential and commercial real estate that also practice property management. There are a few, but this video is not about property management. It is just about tenant procurement. In other words, you're working with a tenant that is looking for a place to lease, and you help the tenant with that transaction. Or you are working with a landlord who's not selling their house but looking to rent it out, and you find a tenant for them. Then after a tenant has already been placed, whichever side of the contract you're working on, either the landlord manages it him or herself, or they hire a separate property management company that is licensed to manage property through the Georgia Real Estate Commission. So this is just about the tenant procurement process, regardless of the side of the transaction that you are on. Now, I'm not going to talk about the whole process. The only thing I do want to talk about is the security deposit. So if the landlord is managing the property, him or herself, and the landlord and any of his family, spouse, children, an LLC that he is a member of, so forth and so on, if that household or that business entity of which he's a member, as long as that group, I'm just going to use the term landlord, owns fewer than 10 properties, then it's different than if that landlord owns more than 10 properties, or if the property is managed by a third party company. And what's different is the security deposit, when and who can hold the security deposit. So, or when and how, all that kind of stuff. So basically the point of this video that I want to make is, regardless of what the law says, it is always a good idea for a tenant and for a landlord, before you accept a security deposit and the tenant moves in, it is always a good idea to go through the property and together make a notation of what damage, dings, so forth and so on, is pre-existing to the property prior to a tenant moving into the property. The reason it's good for a tenant is when you vacate the property, the tenant doesn't necessarily want to pay out of the security deposit for damage that was already pre-existing. The reason it's good for a landlord is if the tenant actually did damage the property, there's no way to prove if it was pre-existing or not. And in Georgia, the Georgia Landlord-Tenant Laws favor the tenant. So you might lose out as a landlord on getting some compensation for damage that a tenant caused if you can't prove that it wasn't pre-existing and the tenant says it was pre-existing. So regardless of what the law says, it's always a good idea to do that. Now, there are forms, there are move-in inspection forms from GAR and through the RE forms, or or anything, but you should notate in writing as of the date prior to moving in the pre-existing condition of the property. Now, what the law says is if the landlord owns fewer than 10 properties, the landlord is not required to give this list out. It states that a landlord who owns 10 or fewer rental units, unless those units are managed by an outside property, does not need to supply a written list of pre-existing damage to place the deposit into an escrow account. However, if the property is being managed by a third party, or that landlord unit owns more than 10 properties, then a landlord is absolutely required to give a tenant a written list of pre-existing damage to the rental before they're legally allowed to even collect a security deposit. Also, landlords in Georgia must also provide tenants with advance notice before taking any deductions out of a security deposit, such as the cost for repairing damage to the property caused by the tenant. A landlord who owns 10 or fewer properties, again, does not need to supply the list of pre-existing property. If the tenant does not agree with the claims that at the end, when the tenant's vacating the property and trying to get the security deposit back, and the landlord has claimed that this is damage caused by the tenant, if the tenant does not agree with the claims, the tenant must indicate which of the items on the list he or she disagrees with, and then sign a statement of dissent. Additionally, after the receipt of a security deposit, regardless if you own 10 or more properties or 10 or fewer properties, a landlord must inform the tenant in writing as to the location of where this money is, the location of the deposit. And if the landlord fails to follow the procedures above, they forfeit their right to keep any portion of a tenant security deposit when that tenant vacates. So this is also another issue. So again, regardless if I've already said this, you guys protect the tenant and the landlord by getting a list of pre-existing damage to the property prior to moving in. If the landlord owns more than 10 properties or it's being managed by a property management company, it's required by law to give this list prior to even accepting the security deposit. The issue is when another issue is when a tenant, when a landlord has a property and they sell that property with a lease in place. Again, regarding the security deposit. Number one, a buyer of a property that has a lease is required to honor that lease. You can't all of a sudden evict a tenant just because there's new ownership. But based on the law that I just read, that a landlord is required to give a written disclosure of the location of that tenant's security deposit. If you're a landlord and you are selling a property, if you're an agent working with a landlord selling a property, and there's still a lease in place, the landlord, first of all, the new buyer is going to want that security deposit, because when the tenant vacates, if there is any damage, you're going to want to take compensation for that damage out of the security deposit if it's been done properly. And so the new buyer is going to want the security deposit from the seller who's selling it, is the current landlord in possession of the security deposit. So you can't, this deal can't just happen between a seller and a buyer there's a lease in place. You have to inform the tenant of where that security deposit is in writing. So when that current landlord or owner sells, you've got to inform the tenant of the new location of that security deposit if the landlord was the one holding it. Lots and lots of issues with Georgia Landlord-Tenant Law. And again, as an agent, typically, unless your company does allow you to practice property management for the public, and again, if you are a maximum one agent watching this video, we do not allow you to manage property for the public. You are allowed to list a property for lease, and you are allowed to do tenant procurement and get that all arranged. But after a tenant is in place, then the management goes either to the landlord or to a property management company. But if you are, regardless, at this stage of the process, it's maximum one policy that we have a fully executed move-in agreement signed by the landlord and the tenant prior to the tenant moving in, for protection for the landlord, for the tenant, and for you as the agent. And then the law is as I have just referenced. If you have any more specific questions, please look up the Georgia Landlord-Tenant Law. Consult with your own broker if you're not a maximum one agent, and consult with an attorney if you are a public person watching this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education.